So I was asked to talk a little bit about the field of political theology in general, and then more specifically of how it might relate to both Christianity and Islam. The question about the relationship between what we call sort of religion and politics is extremely long-standing, right? You have a long history and tradition of reflection on the interaction between these supposed two spheres or fields, right? So if you think, for instance, of sort of classical periods in the Mesopotamian period, in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, where there's reflection on whether or not Israel, the people of Israel, should take a king or they should have God as their king, you already have some of these sort of questions about the relationship between religion and politics. In Plato's Republic, you have a long reflection on the relationship between sort of the philosophers, mythology, and a state. And both in the Christian, not a state in the modern sense, both in the Christian and the Islamic tradition, you have long-standing reflection on what we might consider political organization, social community, the relationship between God, religious authorities, the ruler, democracy, oligarchy, etc., long before any term called political theology existed, right? So think, for instance, in the Islamic tradition of Mawardi or Juwayni, or even Ibn Taymiyyah's reflections on these things. In the Shia tradition, you also have long-standing arguments about the relationship between the imamate and political rule. Similarly, in the Christian tradition, both Latin and Greek, you have these same questions about the divine rights of kings, about the two cities or two kingdoms or two swords. So the field that you might consider religion and politics, or theological reflection on social and community, exists long before there's a field called political theology, right? And one of the challenges in thinking about the theory of political theology is, does it bring anything new to this long-standing reflection, right? What is unique about political theology that is distinct from the study just of religion and politics, church and state, mosque and state? And I think that's one of the bigger debates within the field of political theology more generally. Is political theology, and this is something we'll get to in a minute, is political theology just an umbrella term for a wide range of other discussions, such as public theology, religion and politics, church-state relations, mosque-state relations? Or is political theology a theory that is distinct to that? You can see this already in, I'm an associate editor for the journal Political Theology, and we have this debate all the time. Is a study of John Rawls's account of justice something that should go in the Journal of Political Theology, or something else? And that's something we might return to. I take, personally, and I'll talk about this as we go, I take something of a middle ground approach. There are those who want to restrain political theology only to the legacy of Carl Schmitt and sort of then later what we'd call the new wave of political theology, which I'll talk about. And just simply focus saying that is what political theology is. There's others that want to take it as an umbrella term that encompasses everything. What I'm going to be trying to talk about is, how can we think of political theology as a useful theoretical tool that doesn't do everything, right? We don't expect it to be a theory that accounts for all interactions between religions, the state, civil society, but that can broaden out just beyond the traditional field. So to explain that, let me turn first to the emergence of the term and some of the trajectories. This might be familiar to some of you already. The term political theology really emerges from the work of Carl Schmitt, who you read a section, a chapter, probably the most influential of the chapters, from his book, political theology. Schmidt, if you're not aware, was a German jurist, legal scholar. He was also, it's important to note, a Nazi and a supporter of the Nazi Party. However, he wrote this book, Political Theology, as well as a second book, Political Theology 2, in order to try to give reflection, particularly on questions of power and sovereignty. And his primary reflection in political theology, and why it's had so much resonance in the field, is his attempt to not simply examine the relationship between religion as a distinct category and politics as a distinct category, but asking, how do theology, especially, and claims of the state, claims of law, intersect in ways that are both seen and unseen? And so, specifically in the chapter you've read, you have this opening claim that all political concepts of the modern state are secularized theological concepts, right? So what he's arguing, and why his work has been so insightful, is this claim that in operation, particularly of the modern nation state, theological concepts, theological claims that are operative. Is my internet working? Yeah, I'm getting unstable. Anyway, we can see theological claims that are operative, even when they're not explicitly invoked as religious or theological, which means that we have to read politics, law, elections, society, in ways that move just beyond specific questions around religion. So we don't just look for theology when it's explicitly present. So, for instance, I'm an American, as you can tell. When the United States invokes claims of, God's blessing on America, that's unique. Now, that's something that we specifically look at. Or we don't just look at religion and politics when we see a debate about whether or not a cake baker has to bake a cake for a LGBT couple, right? Those are the places that religion and politics would clearly look at religion, right? All of these debates in Europe, for instance, about circumcision or the hijab or public displays of religion. That's not what Schmidt's saying. What Schmidt is saying is, excuse me, you can look at a deeper level to the way that the state itself and society itself functions theologically, and we can then also read theologically, politically, we can read communities in a dynamic way. So, for instance, he gives the examples, especially most famously, of the sovereign, right? And I'll turn to this later. In the Christian tradition, which he's primarily looking at, the emergence of the Christian tradition, you have this claim, which is also present in Islam and Judaism, that God alone is the sovereign, right? That God is the sovereign who rules the world. Now, this idea that is present in worship, in ritual practices, in theology, has, long before Schmidt, rendered itself in different ways politically. I gave, for instance, the example already of the debate when the Israelites ask for a king in 1 Samuel, and Saul is going to become king, or the people want Saul to become king, but God is saying you shouldn't take a king like all the other nations because you already have me, God, as your Lord, right? However, God acquiesces and lets them have a king. So you have this dynamic, right, between God as king and political representation. In the West, you also have a long tradition of sort of the divine right of kings, that a king or a ruler is put in place by God. So you have historically in the Latin West a connection between political rulers, whether that's the Pope, whether that's Constantine, whether that's in the Byzantine Empire. You have a connection between God as sovereign and the ruler as a representation of God on earth. If anyone has been to Istanbul, anybody, and been to the Hagia Sophia, if you walk out the Hagia Sophia, one of the murals that they've sort of uncovered is sort of Jesus above one of the Byzantine kings and his mother, and he's handing over sort of the crown. This sort of is a Greek enactment of this idea that Jesus physically is handing over the sovereignty, at least the earthly sovereignty, of the Byzantine Empire to the empire. So there's this connection, right? What Schmidt is saying, and what you see happening, is that this connection in the Enlightenment period, and I would actually argue earlier, especially during the Reformation, this explicit connection becomes unhooked in the Enlightenment period, especially he thinks through Hobbes, right? So the explicit idea that the ruler represents the divine in some ways, there's a whole host of ways that this gets played out, gets separated. And the Enlightenment story, the Western story, the one that we, white Western liberal Protestants tell us, that we properly learn to distinguish religion and politics, right? So
sorry, Joshua?
And we created this secular, yes.
Yes, can you just repeat, you cut off that part, can you repeat it?
Yeah,
the last
sorry.
bit. Yep.
So what I was saying is, the Enlightenment story is that I'm speaking now as myself, a Christian theologian, a Westerner, an American, we learned to sever religion and politics, right? And that the Enlightenment, whether it's through Kant or Hobbes or the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, separated this historic connection, right? And that then we take this approach that religion is this thing, politics is this thing, right? That's the sort of story that we tell ourselves. Political theology, especially with Schmidt and his interpreters and readers, challenge this idea. Not that something didn't change in the modern period. He does think something changed, but rather than it be the narrative of religion got out of politics and we learned to privatize religion, what he argues is essentially what we did, or what happened unconsciously, maybe, let's say, is that politics, and especially the modern state, this becomes important. We're not just talking about politics in general, but the formation of the modern state, the Hobbesian Leviathan, comes to take to itself all of these previous theological ideas. The state now becomes the sovereign. The state now becomes the transcendent reference, right? So what was once the transcendent, which was God, now becomes the state. And he gives this most specifically when he talks about the exception and the miracle, right? The sovereign is the one who decides the exception, is what he says. What does it mean to be sovereign? It means you can change the rules. And this becomes important for him, especially because we can. I don't want to. There's been some critiques of certain political theologians, especially Agamben and Zizek, who have tried to comment right now on the contemporary situation through political theology, and they've said some stupid things. But we can think, for instance, about the kind of major decisions that the modern state is taking right now in an exceptional decision, right? Only the state or the sovereign can decide that we're going to close schools, that we're going to ban airline travel, that we are going to stop mortgage. Let's say in France, mortgages are no longer going to be due for 2 or 3 months, right? The sovereign is the one who can make that exception, just like God, the sovereign, can be the one who creates a miracle. Does that make sense? So he wants to say, and I think this is why he's been so fruitful, not just in this example, is that he gives you a way to read politics through the lens of longer standing traditions in theology without necessarily having to have theology explicitly mentioned. Religion doesn't often exists underneath what we think of as the political or the civil. So, for instance, ideas about sovereignty, ideas about community, ideas about justice, these manifest something of the human capacity and longing for transcendence, justice, etc. And what political theology seeks to do, I want to argue, as a theory, is give you a way of interpreting the world that shows how porous categories of religion, right? And this would lead to sort of a school of thinking that you're probably, some of you, familiar with, the sort of Assad. Sorry, I'm seeing I'm unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you can just repeat your last sentence, please.
Yeah, I'm getting so you're seeing a school of thinking that emerges out of, this is going to be the connection to Islam later, that emerges out of political theology, Schmitt's political theology, that wants to question assumptions about these neat categories of religion and politics. Specifically, people like Talal Assad, Saba Mahmoud, and this entire school of sort of critical anthropology. They sometimes use Schmitt, but what they're trying to argue is, look, religion and politics aren't just pre-existing categories, right? They don't just neatly exist. They come into being in history. And for them, the sovereign, the state, in part decides what counts as politics and what counts as religion. One of the things that I teach an Islamic law course with my colleague Mona Siddiqui here in Edinburgh, and one of the things we have British students that they're always shocked about is how Christian Britain still is, right? These are mostly secularized, educated undergrads who went to posh schools, and they have certain assumptions about Britain separating religion and politics and being secular. But then you explain to them how many things happen in British society that are deeply Christian, right? The Queen still decides who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, technically. The Prime Minister, still under law, cannot be a Roman Catholic. So you have these sort of traditions that are deeper, are present. Why do we have Easter off instead of Eid off, right? And so I think what this strand of political theology is attempting to do is to read questions of sovereignty of the modern state in a way that exceeds, it doesn't deny the questions of how do religion and politics interact in secular societies, but it also asks, are we as secular as we think, on the one hand, and how has theology and religion not simply disappeared, but transformed? How has the modern state come to take to itself many of the things that we used to ascribe to God? So that's sort of, I think, the deeper theory of political theology and why it's been so important. And then I'll ask if you have any questions about that before I turn to some of the stuff around Islam and comparative work. Just points of clarity, we can get into a deeper discussion later.
Let me ask them. If anyone wants to ask a question now, you can unmute yourself, please, and ask, or you can even type in your question.
I got one question on the side saying, according to Schmidt, political theology is the manifestation of religion in political life in regards to governance. I mean, I think that's on the right track, Emna, but it's not totally there. It's partly a way of saying how do these ideas, and he's thinking especially of the West, how do these ideas that the West thinks it's gotten rid of, right? It's moved beyond, still operate, but under a different guise. So I'll give an example. Martin Luther, this is before the Enlightenment and the Battle of Westphalia. This is an example I like to give. He wrote an essay called On the War with the Turks. If you remember, Martin Luther starts the Protestant Reformation in 1517. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire is increasingly moving into southeastern Europe, and there's a battle, of course, between the Roman Empire. Sorry, it's saying I'm unstable. Okay, there's a battle. Sorry, I'm getting unstable. There's a battle going on between the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. At first, Luther is asked his opinion about this shortly after the Reformation starts, and he's sort of actually semi-positive to the Turks and saying, we have bigger issues. By the late 1520s, he sort of changed his tune, and he writes this essay called On the War with the Turks. What he essentially argues is something related to his theology of the two kingdoms, that God rules the world with both a right hand, which is the spiritual hand through the church and preaching and sacraments, and through his left hand, through civil society, the second use of the law as a constrainer. And what he argues is that if we go to war with the Turks and the Pope commands it, and you see a cross going into battle, you should run away. That you can't essentially wage a Christian war against the Turks. If the Pope commands you, you should say no, because the battle is not one that can be justified through the Catholic Church as it exists, right? So he seems to be saying you shouldn't go to war with the Turks. There is no sort of Christian justification for war. God doesn't command you to battle against Muslims. That's the start of his argument. However, as he goes on, he says, that said, because you should run away if it's the cross, but if the prince commands you to go because you need to protect your people, then you have a right to do it. This looks, if you don't know political theology, what this looks like is sort of a proto-secularism. Don't have a religious war, have a civic war if it's necessary and only in defense. Right? That's what it looks like. But if you read him more closely and you read him through Schmidt, what he actually says is, if the prince commands you, it's as if God commands you. So he actually transfers what was sort of the way that religious authority was tied into the Pope, he then transfers it to the political ruler. He doesn't do this on purpose. I don't think the essay's as bad as it thinks. But what Schmidt's reading would say is, what we think is happening is a separation of religious power and political power in Luther's essay. That's what it looks like. But if you read it more closely, it's actually a transfer of divine justification from the church to the state. Now the state is invested with sovereignty, with power, and even with divine justification, because the prince is put in place by God. Does that make sense? The difference in how you would read these two essays? If you read it just as this one essay, I'm getting a question. Okay. So that's I think what's at work. Someone's also asked on the side why Schmidt is important. Marx, for instance, draws a parallel between Christian theology and the early modern state. It's certainly true that there's other thinkers. I mean, Hobbes, for instance, Spinoza, Marx, that Schmidt draws on. I think he's partly important because he coins the term, and he focuses the question on the issue of sovereignty specifically. And sovereign, who is the sovereign, becomes the guiding question in a lot of political theology. So that, I think that's sort of the backdrop of this. What you have emerging in the 70s and then later is renewed interest in Schmidt. He wasn't that popular in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. He gets picked up in part by what is called the New Political Theologians, a group of German Christians, Jürgen Moltmann, who's a Protestant, Johann Baptist Metz, who is a Catholic, and Dorte Sola. She's they begin to pick up his work, but engage with it in much more explicitly confessional ways. What does it mean for a Christian church, or sorry, I'm unstable again. A Christian church to be engaged politically, not simply in civil society, but thinking about the world theology, thinking about politics theologically. I think that's the key difference, Usman, between Schmidt and Marx. What Schmidt is asking you to do is to think about politics theologically. And not, I mean, for Marx, in some sense, he wants to recognize this history, but there's more of a desire to disband theology in some ways. While I think one of the reasons Schmidt becomes popular is that he encourages it. So that's the background. I'm aware I've got about 10 more minutes, so I want to shift away from the Western story. So from Schmidt, what you end up having happen in the theory is essentially two strands. I mean, you can talk about more, but especially primarily two strands of thinking. You have the Christian strand of thinking, where Christian theologians begin to use the term political theology in honesty for almost anything they want. You have all of this proliferation of books on Martin Luther's political theology, Augustine's political theology, the political theology of America, etc. But they're primarily Christian thinkers who are trying to engage these questions. That's one strand. The other strand is what you might call post-secular or critical theorists who are picking up and developing Schmidt beyond himself. Specifically, people like Agamben, who is an Italian political philosopher. He's got a series of books, The Kingdom and the Glory, where he's trying to read economics in the modern state through these concepts. Foucault is often thought of as someone who's important for political theology because he's looking at sort of the genealogies of power. And so you have a huge proliferation of interest in political theology beyond theology in places like legal theory, political science. And this becomes especially important for Westerners after 9/11. Because I think the interest in political theology in the West, especially amongst non-Christian theologians, grows rapidly after 9/11 because you seem to have all of these examples of how political theology can help you read things like a preemptive war against Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, the suspension of habeas corpus, right? These seem to be, you can read Bush's rule through the lens of political theology because he in some way exemplifies the exception. And it's a period of crisis. So you have this interest amongst political theorists, legal theorists, critical theorists in this. So you have these two strands. Does that make sense? So up until very recently, political theology has been primarily a Western, and I mean Latin West, theory and practice. The vast majority has been focused on Europe and the United States and the sort of legacy of Christianity and post-Christianity. In the last decade or so, there's been an emergent interest in saying, can political theology travel? Right? Is it a theory that works outside of, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the sort of places that have the legacy of Western European Enlightenment? And there's a question, especially of, is political theology a category that can make sense of Islamic political thought and Islamic political practice? Or is the theory of political theology not essentially fit for use? Is it something that is so tied to the West that it doesn't make sense? And I think that has been ongoing debate. I personally am committed to it being a helpful. Sorry, my internet. I think the whole of the UK's internet is slowed down because everyone's at home. So we're getting much worse than normal. Anyway, I'm personally committed to it being a helpful category. You can see in the essay that I wrote, a category that helps us interpret and engage with Islamic political thought, especially in the modern period. And I'll explain that briefly before we have our break. A former colleague of mine, Abdul Rahman Mustafa, who's a scholar of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, and I just got a contract to co-edit the Cambridge Companion for Islamic Political Theology. So we're committed to this idea. And we're committed to it not simply as a way to interpret religion and politics in Islam, but as a device that can both illuminate Islamic political theological practices on the one hand, but also that the Islamic tradition can push back on some of the assumptions and categories that have dominated the West. And that's what I tried to sort of sketch out, why I sent you Roxine Ubin's essay. She's not talking about political theology, she's talking about political theory, but I do think she helps us think about some of these questions of comparison and why it's important. That is from a book of hers on Said Qutb, and it's the final chapter. And what she's essentially gesturing towards is making an argument that too often Western readers of someone like Qutb, Maududi, Qardawi, even someone, we'll leave aside the sort of bin Ladens of the world, even someone like Rashid Ghanouchi, are in fact not, they are involved, of course, in the Islamic tradition, right? They're drawing on certain figures, certain traditions, but they're also engaged because of the post-colonial reality in questions about what does it mean to be the sovereign? What does political community look like? What are the borders of belonging? And that these kind of questions, which have been long present in the Islamic tradition, but for instance, the question of divine sovereignty and human sovereignty, it is present historically in the tradition. I know the Sunni tradition better than the Shia tradition, so I'll use that reference point. So, I mean, a few of the most important Sunni political texts, Mawardi, al-Juwayni, Ghazali, they sort of assume that there has to be some sort of human sovereign, right? If you use Mawardi, he starts by talking about the caliph, who's protecting, commanding the right, forbidding the wrong. But there isn't a preoccupation with the question of, is the divine sovereign usurped by political representation? The sort of debate that dominates from Maududi, Qutb, Torebi, the debate about divine sovereignty, human sovereignty, and the Sharia that dominates late 20th century political thought is not that present in pre-modern Islam. That's not to say that they're not asking questions about God, what does it mean for God to be sovereign? But the question of political sovereignty, divine sovereignty, and human sovereignty, that is a dominating question in Islamic political thinking in the late 20th post-colonial situation, is not the dominant question in pre-modern Islam. Does that make sense? So for those of you that don't know, right, there's this big debate well, it's not just debate, but an argument, especially in what sometimes is thought of as political Islam or Islamists, in, let's say, Maududi and Qutb as two of the most important figures, that essentially argue, Al-Buti in Syria as well, that the claim that God alone is Lord, that God alone is sovereign, demands that if you take anything but the Sharia as a sovereign, if you take anything but the Sharia as a sovereign, you've compromised on Tawheed. You've denied God's oneness and God's sovereignty, right? This is a recurring argument in political Islam. You have a whole host of other Muslim thinkers, whether that's Muhammad al-Jabri in Morocco, even Ghanouchi later, who sort of make an argument that that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is you've taken to yourself the Sharia. You're claiming the Sharia for yourself. You're making yourself the sovereign, but claiming that it's God, right? So you have this long-standing debate in contemporary and modern Islamic politics about this question: what is the relationship between divine sovereignty, the Sharia, and, importantly, the modern state? Is the state, the modern state of Egypt or the modern state of Sudan, the proper apparatus to enforce the Sharia? Right? You have certain figures who argue it is, and unless it does, we owe no allegiance to it. Right? You have other figures who argue no. In fact, and here I'm thinking like Wa al-Halak's book, The Impossible State, who argue no, the state, by claiming to enforce the Sharia, is not in fact enforcing the Sharia. It's enforcing its own laws, but giving it divine justification. The Sharia has long been a contested idea, whether it's in the Sunni tradition, whether it's in the Shia fiqh tradition. You have a recognition of multiple schools. You have a recognition. Yes, the Quran is clear. The Hadith are vitally important, but themselves contested. But the fact, for instance, that the Hanafi tradition and the Shafi'i tradition disagree on fundamental ideas or conclusions about what is the ramification indicates already the problem. And what political theology might do that would expand this debate is give you tools beyond just essentially reformist versus political Islam to analyze and operate what is going on. How have things shifted? Why, for instance, I'll give the example of Mecca, and then I'll close. In historically around the Kaaba, you had four pulpits in the corner to represent the four Sunni schools of the four madhabs, right? The four schools of law that are all considered orthodox. Those no longer exist. They've been taken away. And why is that? You could say, one way of reading it is to say that actually what the Saudi state has done isn't purified the Kaaba to bring it back to the way it was during the Prophet. What it has done is essentially taken to itself the authority to act as the ulama, the authority to act as the lone qadi or fuqahan, right? It now is the jurist, not jurists, but the Saudi state. And by eliminating the plurality, it's taken to itself this history. What I tried to look at briefly in the essay that I had you read, but also in the longer project that I'm working on, is to say, what are some of the tools that would allow us to not only read Islam through the lens of political theology, but also read political theology in the West in a way that brings in, my own interests are in the Arabic world, some of the histories and stories there. How do we take seriously the difference for the difference in importance, for instance, between the sovereign versus the jurist? How do we take the importance? Schmidt gestures to law being important in that essay, but it becomes very different in the Islamic tradition than it is in the Western tradition. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about this theory is that it allows us a possibility for the theory to be revised in light of the Islamic tradition. And so there's a possibility of reading these things dynamically. I'm going to close. I know I'm a little over. I'm always over. I'll close. I was told to give a couple examples. So let me give you two very quick ones of how this might work. One taking from Europe and one taken.
Can we possibly have the examples after the break? Is that all right?
Go ahead. That's
Beautiful.
Fine by me. I could use more coffee.
Sorry about that. So we'll just break. We were originally supposed to break for 15 minutes. We'll break for 10. And then when we come back, Josh, if you can give us those examples, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. Sorry.
See you guys in 10.
Myself? Yeah, so I think one of a theory is only as good as its capacity to produce interesting insights. I know that there are some scholars who are obsessed with theory and methodology. I'm not that person. I'm much more interested in the work that theories and methods can do to either read texts or read situations in new ways. And so one of the things that I find interesting about political theology, but also my own work tries to bridge, I know you already had a session with Frank Clooney on comparative theology. My own book, in the first chapter, I try to make an argument that political theology needs comparative theology, and comparative theology needs political theology, that there's a productive engagement between these two theories if we're going to talk about reading across the Islamic and the Christian, the Western, and in my case, the Arab context. You need to be able to both do political theology, but also the comparative capacity to let the Islamic tradition speak for itself before you impose Western categories is also important. So that's just a point of clarification. I think just two brief things of how political theology might help us read the context. One is, in my own work, it's been particularly helpful in interpreting European responses to the Syrian migration, especially from 2015 and onwards. What you have happening in Europe and I've been on a task force for the last 4 years visiting the Greek Macedonian border, Lebanon, Lampedusa, Germany, Budapest. What you see happening, yes, is political theology isn't the only thing happening, right? There's legal questions, economic questions, the rise of nationalism. But one of the really interesting things happening in Europe is this sudden recovery of Judeo-Christian language and an alliance between Judeo-Christian language. The heritage of Europe is Jewish and Christian, or especially Christian, and it's merging with secularism. So it's not simply that Christians are saying, we have a Christian heritage that we need to either protect, or a Christian heritage that calls us out to care for and love and welcome people. You see both of those things happening. But what you also see happening are people, both politicians and right-wing atheists, invoking Christianity in order to close borders, right? Why? Because they make an argument that Judeo-Christianity, sorry, I'm unstable again, that Christianity is unique in that only Christianity can secularize, right? So they're not, in fact, they're not wanting to open churches, have people return to church in Europe. They're invoking a Christian legacy in order to close down Europe that, in fact, isn't Christianity as such. It's Christianity as this idea which can easily meld into secularism. So for many of what you see happening in the discourse, if you compare it prior to 2015, you have a lot of what you might call ardent secularists, Ian Hershey Ali, whatever her name is, Douglas Murray, who are against the public display of religion. They want Christianity to be further excluded from European public life. Though many of those same figures are now positively invoking Christianity. Even Richard Dawkins, for instance, saying, the church bells in Oxford are beautiful, unlike the ugly call to prayer. Now, there's a whole host of things you could say is going on, racism, xenophobia, etc. But I think what political theology actually helps you do is realize that this is a longer tradition. And this is partly the Eubene essay, that the West, the very idea of Europe, whatever Europe is partly constructed over and against its boundaries. And its boundaries, can be Russia, if we want it to be, but it can also be, the Mediterranean. Europe was once actually, the Mediterranean world was once the center of Europe. It wasn't where I am in Scotland was the barbarians. If you were in modern day Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, that was the center of Europe as an idea. It moves, and it partly moves because of religion. And I think that political theology helps us interpret European discourse around migration, and it helps us see why the borders of Europe continually shift. I'll give you one example, the final example. When I was in northern Greece in 2016, they had just closed the Greek Macedonian border. So all of the people, mostly Syrians and Iraqis, were now stuck in Greece. Spray painted on one of these containers was a sign in Arabic. I can't show it. A sign in Arabic that would translate as saying, "Tomorrow we cross into Europe." Tomorrow. So some Syrian who was in Greece, which ironically, right, is in some way the center of the history of European culture, democracy, philosophy, etc. They themselves recognized that the borders of Europe had shifted. The rules changed. Greece was no longer Europe. in some sense for a refugee. And in fact, Joseph Ratzinger, when he was the Pope, Benedict, he wrote an essay saying Europe is more an idea than a geography. Why is Europe different than Asia? It is the same geographic space, continent, right? If you look at it. Well, in part because of this construction. I think political theology helps you see that what's happening in Europe in these debates is not simply economics. It's not simply questions of numbers or xenophobia or racism. Those are all at work, or economics. It's also a question of theology, of what does Europe understand itself to be, and how does its self-understanding exist over and against those who are outside it. To give an example, I am a migrant. I have to get a visa. I have to pay extra money, but I'm never in the UK called a migrant. No one ever, I mean, obviously, the way I can, but no one, I travel with my colleague Mona Siddiqui, who is a Brit, raised in Yorkshire, but she's continually asked, where is she really from? Are you a migrant? Right? So part of this, of course, has to do with the fact that she's brown-skinned and has the name Siddiqui. But I think theologically that you can also see yes, I'm not denying that racism isn't part of this, but you also, political theology is saying, what are some of the deeper ideas and theological constructs that are at work, right? That allow Europe to continue to sustain itself and exist in this way. I could use an example from Egypt as well, but I'm aware that we're kind of out of time, so I'll save that, and maybe that'll come up in the question and answer of how I think you can see something similar at work in Sisi's regime in sort of taking itself. You can see this in the Emirates as well. You have these rulers taking to themselves what is moderate Islam, and making certain claims both towards Christians and towards Muslims that are really less about Islam and more about the state's control. But I'll save that for later. So any questions more broadly about the theory or about how it might work, either on the side or elsewhere? I know some of you have to pray Maghrib.
So if you're not sure, yep, we've got someone raising their hand. Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Joshua. That was really fascinating and stimulating. I had a question actually about the concept of political Islam, because from 2004 to 2014, I studied Islamic theology, Middle Eastern politics, and worked in counterterrorism. I never once came across the term political theology, and I hadn't even heard of it until I began to do a PhD in Christian political theology. But the term I heard almost every day was political Islam by both Muslims and non-Muslims. It was used in Arabic, in op-eds, books. And I've wondered ever since whether political theology was kind of marginalized by this notion of political Islam. And I wondered if you could just comment on what you see to be the differences or relationship, because you don't come across something called political Christianity
right.
in Christian theology or even secular sociology on Christianity. And so I've just always wondered about whether the two traditions just developed two different concepts for talking about politics and religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complicated question. It's part of my own interests. The term political Islam or Islamist is extremely contested and complicated. What do we even mean, right, when we say political Islam? What we really mean is certain strands that usually come out of, the Ikhwan, right, the Brotherhood, That's usually what we're talking about. We're talking about the Brotherhood, we're talking about Hamas, we're talking about Al-Qaeda or Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra. This is what we're sort of usually talking about. But then that becomes a catch-all that then explains any form of Muslim political life. And so I think methodologically, Islamism and political Islam really is trying to describe a group that the sort of emergence out of the Ikhwan or the emergence out of the Iranian Revolution. That's pretty much what they're talking about. Hezbollah, these kind of groups. It's since expanded to become anything and everything often. You don't hear political theology related to these groups. So even in the Yubin book, which I think is fantastic, she doesn't talk about political theology. She talks about comparative political theory, and she's trying to make an argument and take Qutb as an intellectual more seriously than we have in a whole host of ways through questions of sovereignty, questions of community, questions of justice. And my wager and some other people's wager is that by using the term political theology, we can not only read so-called political Islam afresh, but we can also analyze these so-called moderate Muslims in different ways, especially to out my own politics, especially a lot of these authoritarian governments in the Arab world that purport to both protect moderate Islam and religious minorities, right? So whether that's Assad in his own ways, whether that's Sisi in his own ways, whether that's the king of Jordan in their own ways. I'm not equating these three people, right? They are different, right? Or the Emirates or MBS. So I think that's one thing. The other is one of the few people who uses political theology to analyze so-called political Islam is Andrew March, who has a new book called The Caliphate of Man. And it looks at classical Islamic political thought, but then especially at al-Banna, Qutb, Maududi, and then Ghanouchi. And Ghanouchi ends up being kind of the hero of the story. But what he's trying to argue is that in the what political theology helps you see is a shift in political Islam from these earlier fixations on divine sovereignty. But he thinks that political Islam actually helps you see that this focus on divine sovereignty and the Sharī'a, and what Nathan Brown calls the democratization of fiqh, that now everyone can be a fuqahan. You don't, right? Like go on the internet, and you've got people whose Arabic is non-existent, who don't know the schools, who are giving fatwas, right? Or creating little hipster videos. That this democratization of fiqh actually, ironically, is an encouragement of popular sovereignty. So that this isn't the case in Maududi necessarily, but by the time you get to Ghanouchi and even some, I mean, I know we have a PhD student here from Kuwait who's working on post-Islamist, post-secularism, and looking at figures that essentially they are Islamists. They still want to focus on some of this, but they're trying to rethink the category of secularism in a new way. So that's a long answer, but I think you're right to say the focus has been on political Islam, not on political theology, because as I tried to say in my short piece, which was part of a longer series, political theology has been a Western category. And even when you translate it into Arabic, as I talked about in the essay, there's a huge a huge question. Does this word even work, or is this a Christian term? And I think I was at a conference in Beirut, two different ones, one on Christian, Middle Eastern Christian responses to political theology. So there was Maronites, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants from Palestine, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria. They're more than fine to use the term political theology as just a straight translation with Lahod. But then we had a conference later on political theology, Islamic political thought, critique and theology, which had a lot of Muslim thinkers, and they were not happy with that term. They wanted to use Turayth, right, tradition. So that's just to say, if we're going to talk about this, it has to be nuanced. But I mean, some of it is my own. I think political theology can help us better read political Islam than the fixation on sort of questions of terror.
Wonderful. That's so insightful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just encourage you all as well, if you haven't written your field, please write it in the chat box. And we do have two questions from Dr. Mashid Ansari.
I don't have two anymore. I think one of it was already answered with Jonathan's question. Thank you, Joshua. It's wonderful to have you. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was just wondering, particularly with the use of how political theology is based on Carl Schmitt, you said, and he was a neo-Nazi. That sort of sent some alarm bells in me. I'm not very familiar with political theology, so this has been quite insightful. I'm just curious as to how, you know, I'm not a pacifist as such, but do you think that this interest in Schmitt in particular may have motivated some, the rise of political nationalism in some countries, which personally I find problematic as a, you know, yeah, I don't know if you understand my question or if you wanted to comment to that. I just was sort of like, oh, he's a Nazi, and why are we looking at why are Christians studying him so much? I mean, I'm not denying that a person may have good to contribute, but yeah, I'm just my cautious side, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, he wasn't a neo-Nazi, he was a straight up Nazi. And there's lots of questions that one can ask again about like Heidegger as well, who's also extremely influential in certain strands of philosophy. I think a couple of things. There is a debate amongst people like Moltmann and Metz and Dorte Sola. They didn't primarily rely on Schmitt. In fact, they rejected him. The irony, of course, is that while Schmitt himself was an extremely right-wing conservative thinker, his work has primarily been used by more leftists. He was actually, I think, primarily trying to justify the state, and most other people have used his work to say, here's an insight that we can challenge the state's hegemony, especially the state's claim to usurp sovereignty to itself. And so one of the reasons that I think there's been an interest in him is, you know, you have people like Foucault who, or Agamben, who are much more leftist, who are saying or even like Talal Asad or Salman Mahmoud, what he gives you is a way to be critical of this, what he thinks he's justifying the state. And that the sovereign has this right of exception. And what many people who use him are arguing is actually what he shows you is how fragile it is, how unjustifiable it is, and it gives us the possibility to unhook sovereignty from the nation state and find alternative ways of organizing, existing, living. And so I think that's one of the it's like kind of an ironic productiveness. That said, there is a strand of thinkers like Jeffrey Stout, who teaches at Princeton, who thinks that, or he just retired from Princeton University, he thinks that the fixation on Schmitt is totally wrong and problematic, and we need to find other forms of thinkers, not just Hobbes. He likes someone like Emerson or Locke or Tocqueville or Martin Luther King Jr. I'm not heavily committed to Schmitt myself at all. I don't even know if I quote him in my book, maybe in passing. What I think why he becomes important is a way to say, can we read things differently? So rather than us just saying, when Sudan claims to enforce a Sharī'a state, is what's really happening just religion taking over politics? Is that really what's happening? Religion's crossed the boundary that it's supposed to have? Or is there more going on? Is there ways in which is this a form of post-colonial critique and resistance, both towards sort of towards the West? Is this actually a form of the state deploying religion for its own power? And I mean, look at Egypt, right? You get rid of Mubarak, but you don't actually change the underlying structure of what is functionally a military and police state. And then, all Morsi is the Brotherhood version of this, and then all Sisi is the moderate Muslim version of this. So I think that's why it's not Schmitt himself that is important. It's the idea that we can interpret religion and politics in ways that are more dynamic and porous than we have before. That's why he becomes important. But most people don't want to go with him in his own analysis.
Sorry, Zaina, may I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Yeah. I think I'm just shifting away this question in terms, because my interest is more in Quran translation. But anyway, I'm just trying to link this. It's very interesting, by the way. This topic is very interesting. It's the first time I've been exposed to it. But trying to link it to this, the rise of the interest in the Quran, especially after 11 September. And we see that the discourse about verses from the Quran, particularly verses of war and verses of women. And that's the interest from both sides, whether Muslims or particular in the West or non-Muslims. So we saw a rise in Quran translations. So after 11 September, we have about 6 different Quran translations into English that were translated, and there was massive sales. And then you have from the debate, the discourse that was happening, whether from the political point of view, media, the micro level. How does the political theology read this aspect?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I'm not sure political theology, if there's been any work on sort of political theology in the Quran, or Quran translations, or all of these debates about gender equality, the verse about striking, verse about in Surah Al-Baqarah about war. I get these emails all the time personally. I mean, I get random people who I've never met sending me long emails with all of these verses telling me, don't I know that Islam is horrible? And I'm a fool for trying to engage. But in terms of political theology, I honestly don't have an answer. I think one of the good things to be an academic is to admit you don't know. There has been work in, like, one of my colleagues, Shadab Rahmatullah, who looks at this through the lens of liberation theology, which he would say some people consider a form of political theology. insofar as liberation theology and political theology in the 60s, 70s, and 80s emerged around the same time. So insofar as these sort of interests in the Quran, questions about the relationship between the Quran and the Hadith, have in large part an increasing socio-political interest, not just a tafsiri interest. I think political theology might be a helpful tool, but that's not work that I've ever done, to be completely honest. My focus has been much more on the the fiqh and the kalam tradition than it has been on the tafsir tradition. But I do I think there's something at work, and I think you're onto something.
Thank you very much.
Sasha has a comment. Would you like me to read it, or do you prefer to read it quietly?
I also ask you a question, or maybe two questions, if I may. Hello.
Yep. Go for it, Sister.
One is you mentioned, Joshua. I think I'm really taking very thought-provoking statements, sentences from you. I really need to go back and think about it. Really, it is thought-provoking. Thank you for the session. You mentioned about comparative theology and political theology, how to read them together, and how useful it would be. Do you think it's because of understanding the human nature and how the similar, I think, concepts are occurring in other religions? I'm just thinking Buddhism, although it seems like very unworldly, still it is very much a kind of incorporated in the political rhetoric in Myanmar, let's say, in different places as well. So it seems like it is a recurring maybe concept and part of human nature. Is that because of this, or maybe what are the other wisdoms in understanding political theology in relation to comparative theology? And also another question, if I may ask, is there any ethical discussion in this political theology concept, politics, and we are talking about sovereignty of human being, or how a human being can take on this on behalf of God, or all these relationships? What you mentioned in a few places, a few times, in terms of understanding the changing, shifting dynamics, maybe geographies or concepts, that is good to be able to understand better. But is there also another agenda when we are using this, I think, theory, in addition to understanding the relationships better?
Those are helpful questions, and then I'll respond to Sasa. Is that comment? I think first, let me say, why do I think political theology and comparative theology might be helpfully brought together? First is, I think comparative theology allows you to recognize both what you're calling human nature similarities, movements, on the one hand, but also attend seriously to particularity and difference on its own terms. So when we come to political theology, I don't, as a Western Christian, go read Arab Islamic thinking and expect it to map directly onto Western categories. I don't go in saying, where is the religion and politics? Have they separated it right? Is the Ummah the same as the Ecclesia? I expect the Ummah to actually be different. Comparative theology allows me to read another text on its own terms and then move back and forth. But as you say, the thing about political theology is, and Dr. Ansari had said this already, we also have to talk about the reality of global dynamics, that you have a rise of, let's say, right-wing nationalisms across the globe. whether this is in India, Myanmar, the United States, Britain. I don't know Australian politics that well, so I'll leave that uncommented upon. I know your migration policies. Egypt, right? So we also have to see that these are global dynamics that are transnational and transreligious. Why is that? What is at work? But then how are particular traditions and histories being engaged there? And so I think by thinking, what I don't want political theology to do if it starts to engage with the Islamic tradition is simply transplant itself into Indonesia or Pakistan or Nigeria or Egypt and expect it to be the same as the West. Because one of the things that political theology has done, I think, well, especially when you bring it into some of the debates about secular studies, is attend to genealogies and histories. And the genealogy and history, for instance, of secularism in North Africa is very different than it is in Western Europe. So as, you know, Ghanouchi says, secularism came on the back of hasn't left sense. The way that secularism came to Tunisia, he says that secularism came to Tunisia on the back of a tank, right? And it hasn't left since. So the history, theoretically, of secularism in the West is as a tool of peace between warring nations or wars of religion. We'll challenge whether that's the true story. The history of secularism in many places in the Arab world or in Pakistan and India or even in Turkey has been a top-down enforcement, often through military means. So you have to attend to this reality. To get to your point about ethics, I think, you know, at the end of the day, for many of us, we're not just scholars. We're also human beings with certain existential and social commitments. And I think that one of the interesting things that political theology can do, and is increasingly trying to do, is not just interpret, but act. Have a form of social belonging and social engagement that can lead to action. And increasingly, Vincent Lloyd, who's the editor of political theology, he's been reading sort of social movements through the lens of political theology. How do we read things like, I lived in Ramallah for 2 years in Palestine. How do you read on the Nakba Day that you have Palestinian Christians processing through the streets, holding crosses and icons on the one hand, but also in the other holding a key to their home that they lost in Jaffa, right? How do you read Muslims who, when Al-Aqsa is banned from prayer, who nonetheless walk down Salah ad-Din Street and stop in the streets to pray in front of the police? Or the Orthodox Christian who joined this with his Christian prayer book. Now, political theology has a way of I think right now what's interesting is it's increasingly saying we need to be reading these things, not just texts by Hobbes and Ghanouchi, but the actual actions of people. What does it mean that, I'll give another, that the Italian church, some Italian churches, have refused the government order in Italy to stop rescuing human beings stuck at sea and continue to rescue them even as they're being impounded? How do we read that politically? Not just read that, but for those of us with ethical commitments to justice, how does that then become a spur for our own action? And how does political theology help us imagine ethical action that exceeds just the ballot box or public protest, that allows for creativity. And that, I think, to your point, is ultimately, for me, the aim of political theology. It's not just to write books, but it's how do we engage in movements of social solidarity, of social engagement, of social of justice, right? That we can engage, and how do we attend to movements of power that both corrupt our own selves but also corrupt our societies.
Sorry, Josh, I'll just jump in. I think you answered my question at this stage as well. Because that's where I was pointing at, is how do we read, or how does political theology read the actions of people in terms of their behavior towards, after 11 September, towards turning or shifting to their interest in religion or in the Quran particularly, whether negatively or positively. Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think one of the things that that maybe this is my own theological commitments as a Christian coming out of the Augustinian tradition, and particularly sort of some forms of Reformed theology. So I have deep suspicions about human beings and human society, right? That it inevitably, even in our best intentions, we fall short and we corrupt ourselves. We're kind of stuck. So in terms of the Quran, I mean, one of the things that I don't find helpful is, I'm not saying this about the Quran, let me be clear, but about, let's say, Muslim communities or Christian communities. There's this desire to sort of either get religion off the hook completely, or blame religion for everything. So there's this desire to say, well, if we just did the Christian tradition right, if we just followed Jesus this way, or we had our theology that way, or our worship this way, then, everything that's gone wrong in the history of Christianity, colonialism, patriarchy, racism, et cetera, violence, that's not real Christianity, right? That's just corrupted Christianity. This is a story we like to tell. Or, I mean, Muslims do the same, vice versa. So I think one of the things that political theology at least helps me do is be honest, right? The human being, let me frame it this way. Even if as a Muslim one wants to say that the Quran as God's word is without error, without flaw, is the forthcoming, and et cetera, that doesn't mean that human interpretation of the Quran is without flaw, without error, without corruption, right? We have to make a distinction between the Quran as the divine word and the human who reads the Quran.
The interference of ideology in interpretation.
Exactly. And I think, I mean, that obviously I'm not a Muslim, so I have different views on things. But I think one of the things that political theology can do or help us do is get out of the fixation on essentialism. Either the Quran is essentially, or Islam, let's say Islam, is essentially the true Islam is a peace-loving religion. You hear this kind of thing. Daesh has nothing to do with Islam. That's one trajectory. Or you have the Islam and the Quran, amongst the sort of Islamophobes, is inherently violent. Daesh is the true face of Islam. You hear this as well, right? People have heard both of these claims, right? Yes. I mean, to me, political theology, or even just being a scholar, wants to, of course, Daesh has something to do with the Islamic tradition, even if we want to critique it. But the attempt, I think, that what political theology, the attempt at purity, whether it's the purity of the state, the purity of society, the purity of, is not something we're trying to get at. What we're trying to get at is how the right question isn't, is ISIS the real Islam or have nothing to do with Islam? That doesn't get us anywhere. What political theology can do is say, what is its claims? What is its ideology? How does it narrate history? How does it use hadith? Why does it socially organize? Why does its use of media draw people in? How does it deploy power? How do we understand it so that we can not be sympathetic necessarily, but so that we can challenge it? And I think what political theology does, whether it's with the Quranic interpretation, whether it's hadith, is to say it gives us a way of reading, not just for understanding, but for social action. And that is a much more powerful way than sort of fixating on questions of, is this the true Islam, the true Christianity, or the fake one? Does that make sense? I'm getting a lot of confused looks. Yeah. I think political theology investigates the dynamics behind the rhetoric, but also in the rhetoric, right? So, I mean, and then you can also, it also helps you, sorry, I'm unstable again. It also helps you not only understand the rhetoric within the traditions, but it also helps you understand, I think this is important when we talk about Christianity, Islam, and secularism, the rhetoric by others about that tradition. Why are certain people in the West so invested showing that Daesh is the true Islam? What is it about that argument? What does that say about their self-understanding about the West, about secularism, about Christianity, and vice versa? I mean, I'll give you an example. Before I moved to this position in Edinburgh, I taught at a Protestant seminary for 3 years in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States. It's a mainline seminary, Presbyterian USA, so we're talking moderate to liberal Protestants. Richmond, Virginia, if you don't know anything about American history, two things that are important about it. One is it was one of the sites that were important in the American Revolution. So there's a very famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," that was preached by one of the Revolutionary War heroes, that was preached at a church that was about 2 blocks from where I lived. But down the hill, there's the river called the James, which was the second largest site for the slave trade in the United States after New Orleans. Right? So here's the irony of someone on top of a hill saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," while down the hill, you're involved in the slave trade. Second thing that's important to know about Richmond, it was the capital of the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. And so in Richmond, Virginia, down the main thoroughfare, there are major statues of every Southern Confederate hero. Now, what does this have to do with political theology? I was doing a class at a church, and they wanted me to talk about Islam. And it was right in the rise of ISIS in 2014. And they wanted me to talk about, of course, I wasn't talking about ISIS, but when the questions came, that's all anyone wanted to ask, right? And it was right after, the Jordanian pilot, if you recall, who had been shot down and then was burned alive. Do you remember this event? So someone asked me a question. The first question is, how can there be any religion that allows for human beings to be burned at the stake? One. And two, how can there be any religion or politics that doesn't treat people as full equals. So this is a well-meaning American moderate Presbyterian who's concerned about humans and concerned about the well-being of people. What was interesting to me, how I answered, is I said this: in the back of our church, there's a picture of John Calvin, who was sort of one of the main reformers and very influential in this brand of Christianity that I am a part of. Does anyone know what John Calvin and the city of Geneva did when a man named Michael Servetus came through their city and denied the Trinity? Does anyone know what happened to Servetus? He was tried for heresy and burned at the stake outside of the city of Geneva. Martin Luther agreed to this. Calvin agreed to this. So I said, well, actually, our own Christian tradition has burned people at the stake for not being Trinitarians. In New England, we burn people at the stake for being witches. 1. 2, our Constitution, which we're so proud of, which we think is a beacon of freedom, has written into it that are worth 3/5 of a vote, and they themselves cannot vote. So in our founding Constitution, as an American, we have a document that says certain people are worth less than others. And this theologian that we read in Bible study and that we quote as, an authority, burned some people at the stake. Why did I answer this way? Well, I think one of the reasons that I answered this way and why political theology is relevant is that, especially for many Westerners, we have like historical amnesia about our own traditions, our own histories. And one of the things that Eubin's essay says is, as long as we can other someone else, we don't have to interrogate ourselves. As long as we can say, the Italians did it this way, so the British response to coronavirus is going to be better. And this is one of the things that Schmidt, I haven't talked about much, also emphasizes, that politics is partly about the construction of an enemy. And that political theology is partly about the construction of the enemy. And the fact of the matter is that both Christianity and Islam have largely constructed themselves with the other as the enemy, or at least as the other, right? So for Christianity in the West, we learn to separate religion from politics. Sorry, the sun is finally coming out for the first time all winter. That's the biggest problem for me of not getting to Australia is I'm a Californian who lives in Scotland. So I just needed some sun and warmth. But anyway, back to the point. Christianity, Western secularism has largely, if you look at it, John Locke does this, Jefferson does this, Tocqueville does this, saying, we learn to separate religion from politics, but Islam is din wa dawla. They haven't done it, right? Similarly, if you look at Islamic political thought, I have a chapter in my forthcoming book on this. A lot of Islamic ideas about law, both in the classical period, but especially in the contemporary period, are constructed to not be like Christians, right? So you have this recurring critique. Qutb talks about Christianity as a hideous schizophrenia. Muhammad Abdu talks about Christianity as being irrational and not having a social coherence. Al-Attas in Malaysia talks about the problems of Western secularism. These people aren't all political Islam, right? But but there's a way. I mean, think about Islam, how much of itself constructs as a wasat, as a middle way between Judaism and Christianity. And it does this around law. This is something my book is about, to say Judaism is too strict, Christianity is too lenient, Judaism is too ethnic, Christianity is too spiritual, and what is Islam? It's the perfect middle way. I mean, think about the hadith when Muhammad meets the prophet. I mean, goes up and is offered either wine or water, right? The one symbolizing Judaism, the one symbolizing Christianity, and he chooses milk, right, as a middle way. So one of the things Schmidt does is to say, Western secularism, this is Gil Andejar says, Islam is its enemy, and it constructs itself that way. But I think there's also a sense in which, especially modern, not just political Islam, but other Muslim thinkers have constructed Islamic political thought to say, how can we be an alternative to the West? So Ali Shariati, the Iranian, he does this all the time. He says, look, Islam is the perfect middle way, not between Judaism and Christianity, but between capitalist individualism and communist communitarianism. Islam, especially what he thinks is going to come, is the middle way that combines the individual and the community. And so I think the other thing I should have talked about this, it's on my notes, is by attending to the rhetoric of the enemy, you realize how much of it is actually not about the other, but about yourself. The majority of the history of Christian discourse about Islam is not about Islam, but about internal Christian debates. And I think similarly, although not quite as much, the same is true of Islam. When Martin Luther is talking about Islam, he's mostly actually talking about Catholics, right? He tars Islam. I mean, he tars Catholicism with Islam. Karl Barth does the same thing. Nazis are like Muslims. He's actually one of the first people to do this. So I think one of the other things that political theology has us do is also look at how are we talking about the other in order to make ourselves talk about ourselves? As someone just said, the internal enemy is more frightening than the external enemy. So we had a PhD student, one of his chapters on Ibn Taymiyyah talks about, Shias are worse than Christians, right? He uses Christianity to tar Shiism, right? The Shias have gone the ways of Christians by having too much political ecclesial hierarchy, by investing their imams with authority. This is a corruption not from Islam. They've been corrupted by Christianity. Does that make sense? And I think when you think about the rhetoric of contemporary politics, attending to how is Islam functioning as a trope within, I mean, look at my president's own response to coronavirus. Why is it important for him to not call it the coronavirus, but the China virus? Why is it a foreign thing, right? Well, in part because this reinforces his own construction of sort of American purity, American self-reliance. It's someone else's fault. And I think that is going on right now increasingly in our politics and our rhetoric across the board. Some Muslim leaders are worse than Trump. I won't name names. I'm aware we're running out of time. Any final question or comment?
I would really appreciate if you can give a few more maybe main readings to continue this journey, because I'm really getting more and more interested in political theology after this. And obviously, theories are always sometimes kind of scary. You need to find the right readings to find comfort, to comfort yourself and continue the journey. So it would be really appreciated if you can add a few more readings to the existing readings, or just give.
Yeah, I think I would say a couple things. I can send out an email in the next couple days, maybe over the weekend, to give you a few ideas. I do have to finish a grant before Friday, and my kid's coming home. But the political theology website that we co-run, you can just go to political theology. There's a syllabus resource there that could give you a lot of different professors and lecturers' ideas of what political theology is. What you'll realize is extremely distinct. There's also two sort of political theology primer books, one that's focused much more on Christianity and one that's more focused on political theory. So I can send those two books to you, their ideas. And then I think also for those of you interested in how political theology might help contemporary readings of Islam, since a lot of you are working in Islamic studies, Andrew March's new book, which is called The Caliphate of Man, it would give you an interesting reading of that. We're going to be hosting a book forum about it on the political theology website that we run. So those are a few ideas of resources that might help you. There's a Cambridge Companion to Christian Political Theology that are the Blackwell Reader in Political Theology, and what you realize is it's like 40 chapters on Christianity and secularism, a chapter on Judaism, a chapter on Buddhism, a chapter on Islam, which shows you how the field's really been dominated by secular studies in Christianity. But hopefully in a couple years, our book on Islamic political theology will be out.